Welcome to the Midlife Manifesto, where we are embracing the twists and turns and transformations of midlife. I am Arlene Scholten, your host and fellow traveler on this crazy journey. So if you're looking to reinvent yourself, rediscover your passions, or just make sense of this beautifully messy phase of your life, you're in the right place. I will be interviewing experts on a number of different topics, anything midlife, whether it be your health, wellness, perimenopause, relationships, rediscovering yourself, new adventures, career shifts, raising teenagers, you name it. We're going to discuss it all right here. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's get real about midlife, because it's more than a phase. It's our time to thrive. We can do this together, so join me on my journey. It's crazy, but let's make it some fun. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Midlife Manifesto, where we are redefining aging. And today I am so excited to have Brandi MacDonald with us today. So Brandi, I met her years ago. I've seen her speak on many stages. I'm a chiropractor. She's a chiropractor's wife. And I'm just going to introduce her. So Brandi MacDonald is a sought-after speaker, mentor, and educator in chiropractic and wellness, specializing in nervous system regulation, leadership, and human behavior. With nearly 2 decades of experience, she has helped thousands of chiropractors build thriving, principle-driven practices through neuroscience, communication, and patient care. As co-founder of the Informed Chiropractor, Brandi and her husband, Dr. Don MacDonald, travel globally teaching chiropractors how to integrate polyvagal principles, enhance patient outcomes, and strengthen their businesses. Brandi created Body by Brandi, from burnout to badass, to help women over 40 optimize their health. Known for her no-nonsense, heart-centered approach, Brandi combines personal experience, research, and coaching to help others break through barriers and reach their full potential. Her dynamic speaking style makes complex concepts relatable, leaving audiences inspired and ready to take action. So welcome to my show, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I love the title. That's so fun.
So we are going to dive into all things polyvagal. So I don't know a lot about this. So when I talked to you a few weeks ago, actually, about this, I started diving in, and it is just so interesting. I'm obviously a chiropractor. I did a breathwork course 2 years ago, which I'm sure there's some similarities in there, but I just started really, really getting interested in different ways of dealing with trauma and stress. So we're going to talk all things polyvagal. So can you tell us a
Yay.
little bit in a nutshell, what is polyvagal theory?
Oh, in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Okay, so a
Or
lot of
how
people
do we
want to
get
know.
started so people who
Yeah, yeah,
don't understand
yeah.
what it is?
The first thing I would say, just we could talk about the basic principles of polyvagal. If you're not familiar with it, the best thing to do is to go on YouTube and Google Dr. Stephen Porges, who's the founder of the theory, and just watch some of his videos. To me, that is the
Mm,
best way. I always get a lot of our patients in our practice and women I work with that are not chiropractors, not familiar with it, just to go and just to look up some of the stuff that he's done on podcasts or in videos, because he really is the expert. This theory is probably founded in the early 70s, so it's very new still. And it was his discovery into the fact that the nervous system, in the old days, we used to believe in chiropractic and in many other sciences, there were only two parts to the nervous system. And a lot of the public understand this. They know what the sympathetic nervous system is because we call it the fight flight nervous system.
yeah.
So a lot of people will say, I'm in fight or flight. They know what that means. It means we're propelled for an action. We feel under threat, and the body then prepares us for that. So that's called the sympathetic nervous system. And then we used to say there was something called the parasympathetic nervous system, and it was the contraindicative system to the sympathetic system in the sense that it was the calming, it was the rest and digest part of the nervous system. And it was a good thing to be in a parasympathetic state. And so for years, even in our own practice, we would say to practice members or patients, our job in chiropractic is to help you get out of the sympathetic state
Yeah.
and into a more parasympathetic state. And we said those things for probably almost 20 years in practice.
Yeah.
When we stumbled upon, or rather through the chiropractic lens, re-looked at polyvagal, I am a social worker by trade. I worked in trauma for the first 15 years of my career before I left and came into chiropractic. I had always been familiar with polyvagal, but through a psychology, psychiatry, social work, counseling lens. So I had never really looked at it through this lens of chiropractic or this hands-on healing modality that we use. And I thought, geez, let's take a look at it through that lens. And And here's what we discovered, and rather what Dr. Porges discovered, that there is in fact 3 components to the nervous system. Yes, there's a sympathetic component,
Yeah.
but there's actually 2 parts to the parasympathetic system. And here's where it divulges differently from what we had said in the past. There is a one part of the parasympathetic system, which is the oldest, most ancient part of our nervous system, which is called the dorsal vagal part of the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
This we share with reptiles and amphibians, which if you think about an alligator or a frog, they have the ability to go under the mud and hold their breath for hours or days and not die. They're slow sluggy, right? They're just basically licking their eyeball. We actually share that part, and it's our oldest, strongest, most wired in part of our nervous system called the dorsal vagal component. And it is responsible for a lot of that rest, digest, and intimacy and connection when it is regulated. Here's what we never said before to our practice members. There is no good or bad of the nervous system. All 3 parts of the nervous system, the sympathetic system and the 2 parts of the parasympathetic system, are important. What lives on top of that is this regulatory part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which we call the ventral component of the nervous system. This is a strictly mammal component of the nervous system. We don't share this with frogs licking their eyes. We actually share this with mammals, which means this. That ventral part, which really anatomy doesn't really matter as much to the general public, just to understand that the ventral part is actually developed through, here's the kicker, connection to another mammal who keeps us alive when we're born. Why does this matter? When we are born with a very immature sympathetic nervous system. We are born with a very developed, because it's ancient, dorsal vagal system, and we do not have a ventral system developed yet. What is fascinating about the development, as Stephen Porges found over years and years of studies of newborns in the NICU, is how he first developed it and studied it, and then babies, and then further on with adults, is he realized that this ventral system is actually the regulatory component of all the other systems. This regulatory system is developed through our relationship with another mammal that keeps us alive. There's not a newborn mammal on the planet that can survive without another mammal keeping it alive until we can stay alive ourselves. So think about that. That's really, really important as it relates to both not only the pregnancy process for our women, but also the birth process and what happens post the birth process. Our babies, if those of you that have had babies know that early on, it's really important that our babies know how to latch and suck and swallow and breathe and vocalize. Those parts of the baby that allow us to attend or attune as the caregiver is really important, because when the baby cries, we need to make sure that we are attending and attuning to the baby. We want to make sure the baby's latching properly to something, preferably our boob, and if not our boob, a bottle, so that we can keep it alive. Its ability to suck and swallow at the same time allows a baby to drink while not burping up or having gas and colic, right? So you can sort of see where this goes. All of those behaviors actually start to develop the ventral vagal part of the vagus nerve. So this is all innervated and orientated, the parasympathetics, through the vagus nerve. There's lots of talk today on the vagus nerve. If you look up Instagram or anywhere, people talk about stimulating the vagus nerve and working on the vagus nerve and regulation of the vagus nerve. And the interesting thing about the vagus is that it really doesn't need to be stimulated per se. The job of the vagus is to really surveil the environment, to ensure that we are safe and attended and attuned to. Why? So that we first of all can stay alive. And secondarily, as that ventral system develops, we must stay connected to other humans, because in a herd, if you are isolated in the wild, you die. It's the same with humans. We know unequivocally today through tons of our science that the more isolated a human is, the sicker they are. And so when somebody is isolated and continues to isolate, we know that they are unwell, and they will be physically unwell, because that ventral component of the vagus is offline and unable to regulate the rest of the systems in the body. So that ventral part that's developed, which is really new, very mammal orientated, is something that is of critical importance and probably the least understood part about the parasympathetic nervous system. But to me, the most exciting part about it, because it all has to do with not only regulation in the body, but our connection to other humans.
That's really interesting. Did you read the book? I can't remember the author, is Lost Connection?
Yes.
Yeah. So anyone who really wants to try to understand the importance of connection, nothing to do with polyvagal in the book, but just the human connection. This was written before the pandemic. It is fascinating read, actually. So it's called Lost Connection. Could you just explain a little bit what the vagus nerve is to people who don't?
So
A lot of people probably heard of the vagus nerve, but what is it? Where is it?
So the fascinating thing about the vagus is that if you think of sort of in my experience in our practice, a lot of people don't even realize that they have a bunch of nerves anyways. So unless somebody's getting on your nerves
Just bones, just
or
smooth the
you feel like
bones.
some nerve problem in your arm,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So I'm always saying to our patients, like we're interested in the spine. It's obviously critical. It keeps us upright and
mm,
moving through time and space and protects really important things. The skull protects your brain, the spine protects the spinal
yeah,
cord, and out of every single vertebra, all these spinal nerves come out and they innervate all of our movement, all of our activities, all of our autonomic systems.
yeah.
However, the vagus is really interesting because it's not a spinal nerve. Here's
No.
the most fascinating thing about the vagus. It's a cranial nerve. That actually
So it's a
means it
cranium, just to anyone if they don't know what the
exits out of the head.
yeah, yeah,
And particularly, it exits out the base of the head. So if you put your hand sort of on the back of your skull, that's called your occiput. And out of there, the vagus exits. So you can think about the fact that the rear part of that vagus nerve, it actually comes down, it wraps down around the neck, wraps around what's called the first rib. So sort of think of where the clavicle is, comes down, wraps around the throat, the esophagus, comes down around the stomach. It meshes all over the intestines and all the pelvic floor. And then the interesting thing is it sends information back from this entire mesh system through almost our second or third brain, which is that visceral component.
yeah,
It sends all those messages back up to the brain and lets the brain know this body is safe or this body is in danger.
yeah,
That's the interesting thing. It is a massive nerve and it is considered to be almost 75% of the parasympathetic nervous system. That is how massive the vagus is. And that is why it is getting such traction, I think, in social
yeah.
media and in Instagram influencers and people that do social work and counseling, because we understand that the body is holding a lot of memory that we consciously are not aware of. But the vagus is always sending signals back. So think about the greatest thing is to look at if you Google a picture of the vagus and really visualize how that cranial nerve that exits out of the base of the skull wraps around everything and then feeds information back to the brain stem to say, you know what, you're good, you're golden,
Yeah.
things are great. Or things are not good. You need to fire some responses and protect yourself
Yeah.
really quickly, or stay in that protective response. You start to visualize how important it is that our body is really well taken care of and that we start to get some feeling of what is happening in our body so that we can really change direction quicker than letting things go too long before we're
Yeah.
unwell.
How would somebody, like, what are some of the symptoms to show that your vagus is dysregulated or that an individual is dysregulated? What would you see?
Well, you have to think about, so one of the major concepts of polyvagal is this is a hierarchy. So if you imagine a pyramid, at the top of the hierarchy is the ventral vagus. So that means that is our connection and problem solving with other mammals to keep us alive. That is always, not sometimes, always, once it's developed, going to be our first line of defense in times of distress or conflict. We are wired to work together. Now,
Yeah.
if you just think about the world today, you think
Mm.
that does not make sense.
No.
So you can see what happens when our wiring gets messed up,
Yep.
because the second thing that happens is once we fail or the nervous system fails at problem solving or working with another mammal or a group of mammals under conflict or distress, the second thing that happens right after that is the sympathetic system is engaged. The sympathetic system is our fight flight system, which a lot of people are familiar with. So you
Yeah.
can imagine if you're confronted with fighting a bear or fleeing from a bear, we need to make some real quick decisions in the nervous system as to what it needs to do. So what happens is the blood flow starts to
Yeah.
leave things where it should be covering things like the internal organs, starts to go out to the extremities. We start to raise our heart rate up. We start to raise cholesterol up. We start to raise all this stuff up. Insulin goes up. All of these stress hormones start to go up. And that's a good thing
Yeah,
in the short
exactly.
term. We
Yeah.
want that. You need that. You're going to survive. If you get bit, you have to clot. Your
Yeah.
blood should be sluggy and sloggy when you're bit by a bear.
Yeah.
So those are the things symptomatology wise, people become reactive. They become short with people. They don't tolerate much. They can't sleep because why on earth would you be
Yeah.
sleeping when a bear is chasing you? So that's the second indication that something is now down regulating in the nervous system and we're dropping down the hierarchy. The thing about the sympathetic nervous system is it is metabolically expensive. What
Yes.
that
Yeah.
means is it takes a lot of our energy. And so the nervous system is always self-sacrificial to keep us alive. That's the
Yeah.
beautiful thing about the nervous system. Its job is to keep you alive. So it has to sacrifice certain things. It starts to sacrifice high level things like concentration,
Yeah.
learning, eye contact, staying upright in gravity, digestion, fertility. It sacrifices all of those things. Why? Because the sympathetic nervous system is expensive.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
need the energy for fighting or flighting. Now, over time, now we can't do that anymore. And here's the one that would suggest that we're seeing mostly today in our healthcare practices is now we have to go into the mud. And now we're an amphibian because what happens is once we are metabolically crashed out, and this is what happens to a lot of our women that are 45 plus, we are metabolically now exhausted. Once you
Yeah.
become metabolically exhausted, the dorsal vagal complex is what starts to occur. The dorsal vagal complex, when it is not regulated, is called the circuit breaker of the nervous system. It is like unplugging a robot that's been running too hard, too fast, and smoke is coming out of it. I will unplug the robot and it goes, and it's done.
Sounds like
So
midlife.
exactly. And so a lot of in my menopause work, this is exactly what we see because the sympathetics have really been the job of the woman through the 20s and 30s and 40s as we raise
Yeah.
families and we start businesses and all this stuff happens. And then all of a sudden we go, oh, this is menopause. And I often say, I don't think it's menopause. I think it's metabolic conservation now because we have burned out
Yeah.
a lot of those things we need to be regulated. And now we're in what's called the dorsal vagal state. When we are in this circuitry and it's primarily dominant, there's lots of indications of that. The first one is we'll start to feel a lot of sluggy, not enough drive, not enough get up and go. We get some anxiety with that because what anxiety is that we feel almost wired and tired, where
Yeah.
we feel it in our body, we feel it in our gut. It feels horrible, but we just don't have the energy to get going. We also will see some metabolic challenges with this particular circuitry being dominant, where we often see lots of sluggy digestive stuff. So whether that's constipation or diarrhea, this is the too much, too little. We see lots of what we call dysautonomia, where we're bouncing back and forth between the sympathetic. So we've got a high heart rate and low blood pressure, or high blood pressure and low heart rate. So we start to see all this weird stuff. And in my practice, we see a lot of these patients go to medicine, get every test known to man.
Yeah.
There is nothing, quote unquote, wrong with them,
Yeah.
but they are unwell. That is absolutely an indicator that somebody is in this circuitry as a dominant circuitry and they are now in the mud. We start to see breath being really low. They're not
Yeah.
able to take a deep breath. We have unstable pelvises and sacrums and rib problems, and the list just goes on and on and on. So I just imagine in your life that this is almost a sliding hierarchy and that we always are going to pick the one that's we're going to use at the time that's needed. The problem is if we don't come back out of that state and we don't re-regulate, then the body gets confused because it's almost a self-fulfilling wiring that happens. So now everything becomes threatening.
Yeah.
Everything needs to be metabolically conserved. And now we're just distorted in our perceptions about what's happening because the body's just doing the best it can at that time until we get some regulation again.
That's really interesting. So, what do you think about? Because obviously, when women experience those things, we would always just say that they are perimenopausal symptoms, and there's so many avenues you can go down with perimenopause, and there's so many. I mean, it does seem to be obviously it's a buzzword, and I think it's great that we're talking about it, but it's also we are stressing ourselves out if we have no connection at birth, even or a lost connection as we go through life. We then hit our mid 40s, 50s, hit menopause, and I guess most women, because that's what we're told, would jump at HRT.
Mm-hmm.
instead of actually doing the work to regulate the nervous
Mm-hmm.
system, because that could be
Mm-hmm.
actually one of the biggest contributing factors.
One of the best books that I love, well, there's a couple of them that I would recommend. One of the really, really great books is called Good Energy by Dr. Casey Means. That is a recommendation, as well as the Menopause Manifesto. And one of the things that both of those books, although they're not specifically per se Menopause Manifesto is, but
Yeah.
one of the interesting things is that when we're looking at the hierarchy of hormones, so if we're looking at a metabolically expensive system,
Yeah.
meaning we have spent most of our lives in this fight flight, most of the time we've been raising kids. And what happens is our kids start to get older and they start to not need us as much.
Hmm.
70% of marriages fail in divorce, about 15 years in. So there's lots of stuff that happened in this kind of 40 to 50, mid 50s range. And so now we go, well, our hormones are disrupted. And they are. That
Yeah.
without a doubt,
Yeah.
we will see obviously a metabolic cascade of hormone issues earlier than it's supposed to be, because we have burnt out primarily our adrenals in this fight flight response of being in this in our 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
One of the great things about these books is it talks about the hierarchy of hormones, and at the very top of the hierarchy, unbeknownst to me prior to digging into this, because I'm now in my early 50s, unbeknownst to me, I was thinking, oh, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, DHEA, these are the golden tickets. These are the
Mm.
ones we focus on. It's none of those things. The boss of the hormones are three of them, really, and the top of it is something called oxytocin.
Yeah.
Now, that tip of that boss of every other sex hormone and every other hormone in our body is oxytocin, which
Yeah.
a lot of us think, well, that's interesting. Back to ventral vagal,
Mm.
that's the connection hormone. That's the breastfeeding and childbirth hormone. Well, it comes in many other ways. The problem is that if we're not aware and conscious as to how else to source out the oxytocin hormone, which is just fun and connection,
Mm.
most of the women I work with don't have that in their life anymore. Once they're
Why,
not
why don't
needed,
they have that in their life anymore? And where
I
would they
think,
find it? Where do you get
oh,
oxytocin
you
from?
actually have to create it. So I have done a 30-day oxytocin challenge with a bunch of women I worked with, which for 30 days. So oxytocin, the easiest thing to get oxytocin with is touch. So
Yeah.
that's as simple as massages, yoga, breath workshops, your friends you love, not stressy
Yeah.
friends you love, where you go, you get together with them, you're like, God, this was so, my cheeks hurt from laughing.
Yeah.
That's oxytocin. You might want to go for a walk, nature, your animals, anything that sources that ventral vagal circuitry that regulates, creates an oxytocin. That is, but you have to actually create it, because
Yeah.
when you've spent your life in a sympathetic response, what happens is you habituate to that response. And habituation to stress is usually an addiction to stress. So the way in which we get good feelings is through stress chemicals like
Yeah.
adrenaline and epinephrine. And we go, ooh, but it's not enough dopamine. So we need more of it. And we start to source it through things like social media. We source it through food. We source it through alcohol, through shopping. The high level performers I work with source it through way too much information. They buy
Yeah.
another book, they go to another seminar. That's dopamine seeking.
Mm.
And it makes us feel good for a very short period of time, but it doesn't last. So oxytocin and serotonin play this really nice relationship with our hormones, in the sense that when we do things that are connective and we do things that are fun and we take care of our bodies and we move, it lasts longer than the dopamine and adrenaline feeling that most of us are
Yeah.
searching for, because we've habituated to that level.
Yeah.
So oxytocin is super, super important. The other two are cortisol, and cortisol is really the stress chemical.
Yeah.
Cortisol gets such a bad rap, and it's so
Because we need
important.
it. It
Oh
is
my
important.
God,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
do need it.
Yeah.
Cortisol, people don't realize how important cortisol is, but also when you live in that metabolically expensive sympathetic response, cortisol does get burnt out and you can't
Yeah.
actually produce it anymore. And now we start to get dangerous things with adrenal and thyroid issues. And
Yeah.
so that is symptomatology wise, sometimes why people do need to be on some support for thyroid or adrenal issues in their 40s and early 50s, because
Yeah.
they have actually burned those endocrine organs out by
Yeah.
virtue of their lifestyle. And the third one that I really want to just talk about really quickly is insulin. And insulin is the third chemical or hormone that is a bully on the playground of all the other hormones. Insulin is pretty misunderstood because it's married together with blood sugar. And so
Yeah.
we also looked at glucose factors instead of actually insulin factors. So the book Good Energy is really great read because it has recipes in there and when to eat and how to manage insulin levels. Because if insulin is out of control, and in my experience working with hundreds of women over 45, the number one thing we did other than oxytocin was to get insulin under control.
Yeah.
And that meant they ate less, they minimized powders, like no shakes, no powdered food,
Right.
no bars, and they
Can you
ate in
explain
a,
why? Because a lot of people
oh,
use powders.
oh, oh no, I'm gonna get in trouble because this is
It's okay.
when I first learned this, the funny thing was there's a big PhD and it's like, today I choose powder violence. I'm going to talk about powders and I choose powder violence because I'm going to get violently opposed about powders. Listen, I always say if people want to eat powders, they can eat powders. However, there is a lot of research today, and I think over the next 10 years, there will be even more about the way we modify our food to its
Yeah.
smallest form. And when we modify food down to a powder, because food is interpreted through the GI, interesting. What's
Hmm.
the vagus do? The vagus interprets. It surveils. And anything, one of the major principles of polyvagal is something called neuroception. It is the reflexive response of the body to identify things that are threatening to it, and it launches a response. And remember, this has nothing to do with how you feel.
Yeah.
This has to do with the neurology that lives in the brainstem that's way below our consciousness.
Yeah.
So the neuroceptive surveilling response will identify whether food is appropriate or not for us. And what they're finding with powders, particularly whey, but you could extrapolate that to a lot of powder,
Yeah.
is that it bypasses the glucose response and it does a hyper spike of insulin. How crazy is that? As a former powder addict, and I love my powders. I did not realize that because if you do a glucose monitor and you drink a protein shake, your glucose doesn't really raise that much. So it's actually really good. So you're
Yeah.
like, well, I'm golden. I'm either pre-diabetic or I'm diabetic. I can have it. What they didn't know is that they're not measuring insulin. Now, insulin hyper spikes is one of the few things that bypasses that glucose response and hyper spikes. And hyper spiked insulin is quite dangerous. It's dangerous for the pancreas. It's dangerous for the surveillance system because too much insulin in the blood leads to a whole bunch of other
Yeah.
things. And insulin, again, bullies all the other hormones. And
Yeah.
so insulin is that sort of third hormone to really be aware of in our response of whether the body is in a safe place or not. And remember, I don't mean physically safe, I
Yeah.
mean neurologically safe. So
Yeah.
those would be the three things in midlife, I would say, if people are struggling, that though if you started with oxytocin, cortisol, did some adrenal testing, and looked at insulin and just ate less often, cut the powders or minimize the powders, and don't eat after 5 or 6 at night, you'd
Okay.
be surprised at the change of the hormones over a period of time.
Yeah, because I follow Dr. Mindy Pels, who is also a chiropractor.
Yes.
But yeah, so I started doing her because I used to fast like 17 hours every day. And then it was my
Yeah.
sister who's a naturopath said, you're doing it wrong. You need to
Uh-huh.
follow this woman. So I started and then I realized she was a chiropractor and I thought, oh, I thought she was talking our language. So, but
Yes.
she talks a lot about oxytocin and she talks about just those habits, like even just getting out into nature and just, that connection with friends and like you say, positive people, family. Um, and then she also talks about insulin. Is there anything else that would hyper, because I use a protein powder in my shakes. Is there, so they all bad?
Okay. Uh, would they all create a hyperinsulin response?
Yeah.
Probably. The most amount of research is done on whey.
Okay.
Uh, I am a extrapolator of research. What I do is I go, so I'm a concept girl. So my concept about my body as I age is
Yeah.
this. I have a concept that food is interpreted in my GI, period.
Yeah. So that's a
If you,
intestinal tract for anyone
yes,
that doesn't know.
in my tummy and intestines, it's
Yeah.
interpreted. And it's
Yeah.
interpreted by these really actually quite sensitive cells that let my body know what to do with glucose, insulin, and everything else that happens when you eat. So that's my concept. So if whey powder does that, it would make sense to me that all other powders are going to do the same thing.
Yeah. Okay.
whether it's flour, organic, almond. And that's why this particular person I learned this from said, I choose powder violence, because you actually realize how dedicated we are to modifying food. And
Yeah.
listen, I'm saying this as a recovering powder addict. I was in the bodybuilding world. I ate 6 times a day. So there are lots of schools of thought around nutrition. For
Hmm.
me, my concept today in my 50s, and I'm now healthier, stronger, fitter than I ever was before, and I have not had powders in almost 5 years,
Yeah.
is I do understand the brilliance of it because it's fast and easy. And
Yeah.
so when you are in a state where you are busy all the time, that's something that I like our women to get a handle on, because we should be able to have enough time and effort and reverence of the body to make real food.
Yeah.
And if we don't, we do default to very quick foods. And that's the only reason most of us drank drinks. My grandma never had protein powder, and she'd worked 14 hours a day as a nurse,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So we have just been able to do that because it's been transition, and early on, because it bypassed that glucose response, it was a really good thing, because at the time we looked at pre-diabetes being just about glucose.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh,
And we
that's
know
really
it's not.
interesting.
Yeah, so we know. So, if people love powders, they should drink powders. The only
Yeah.
advice I would have about the powder is that if you love your shakes or you love your green drinks, just eat it with food, because what happens, or some kind of real food, because it will minimize the every time you eat anything, you're going to have a glucose and insulin spike, because that's the
Yeah.
way the body works.
Yeah.
You're just trying to minimize the height of the insulin and glucose spike. And while you're already in that, if you eat it, it will just lessen the impact on you.
Very interesting. I
We
did
call
not
it
know that.
using the spike. Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny. When I taught My Body by Brandy, I had something like 60, mostly female chiropractors in my group. And the boy, I'm telling you, I remember saying the same thing about powder, I guess, but it's been 5 years. And I was just like, that's ridiculous. I've never heard of that before. I will drink these till the day I die. Anyways, over time. And the other thing is with health, when there's a lot to take on, in my mind, I just think to myself, what are the priorities? And when we take in any kind of nutrient and our nervous system is under attack, it's perceiving attack. It doesn't really matter what you do. And so what I've really found is that people can change up their diet. They can stop powders, start powders, eat 3 times fast. However, when they are dysregulated, it actually makes no difference. And so the overarching, I think, hierarchy of getting things under control is
Yeah.
really about understanding that we've spent most of our lives in this really push energy of getting things done. And it's been very expensive for us. And
Yeah.
we've lost a lot of connection to things that allow our nervous systems to be healthy and alert and problem solving and connected to other
Yeah.
people. And if we could sort of shift our focus there first, probably you will make different decisions just naturally after that, because a
Yeah.
regulated nervous system just makes different decisions than a dysregulated one does.
Yeah. And it's interesting when people are struggling, they will go to exercise, they'll go to nutrition, they might do some yoga. But would you agree that most people are quite dysregulated and don't even realize they are actually, and it's just all these little symptoms that are kind of bubbling below the surface. And it's all actually maybe decades of just little micro traumas. Maybe, I don't know, talk a little bit
Absolutely.
about big T traumas, small T traumas, and how that affects us. And maybe then go into some of the tools that we can use, like understanding polyvagal theory. What do we actually do with it? You can maybe understand, but obviously you're still going to feel dysregulated. But what can we do going forward? Are there any tips, I guess, getting to understand this a little bit better, what we can do to actually help to regulate our nervous system so that we can actually take more control?
Yeah, I think another major concept of polyvagal is something called interoception. And so interoception is our ability to feel internally what is going on in our body. This is a basic life skill for survival early on, because that is why our children vocalize, our babies vocalize, because they feel hungry, they feel
Yeah.
wet. We want our children over time, even though we do things like sleep training and potty training, part of our job as caregivers, we want our children to be able to identify when they have to go to the bathroom, when they're tired. Those are things. When they're hungry, are you hungry or are you bored, right? So being able to discern what is happening in our body is a vital sign for aging and vitality. It's a vital sign. And most people can't feel what is happening in their body until it is significant. And
Yeah.
then there's a pain response or a symptomatology response or an autoimmune response that gets a diagnosis, and then it appears that we have some feeling in our body. So one of my sayings is that our job, I believe, as healthcare practitioners and coaches, is to try to get people away from their neck down dead bodies and give them some feeling in their body so that we can make different decisions. So a lot of people want to know what to do. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about is
Yeah.
we're doing a lot of stuff. I'm doing yoga, I'm doing
Yeah.
massage, right? I'm doing naturopathy, I'm doing hormone replacement,
Yeah.
but I still don't feel vital. That is because we're not able to identify what regulation feels like and what dysregulation feels like. And they both have two totally different feelings. That is interoception. That is discernment of feeling in our body. So one of the things that I have our people do early on is at night before they go to bed is just to do a body scan. And in particular, what we're most interested in is we're most interested in, you did this in your breath work, is the breath movement of the chest and the
Hmm.
stomach, the diaphragm, and to really feel the viscera, the stomach. What is happening below your diaphragm? And most people are like, what? I've never even thought about that before. However, because we know that that ancient dorsal vagus circuitry is surveilling mostly that area, that is one of the most critical areas to allow us to give information to the brain as to how we feel. So that when we start to feel anxiety, we start to feel distress, we start to feel discomfort, we can identify it and we can actually let it move through us. When we don't let it move through us, it stays in us and starts to break the body down. And that happens for men and women.
Yeah.
It's the same for both sexes. It doesn't change at all. And so when people are not sure about that, what I will have them do is I'll have them do their body scan at night, or if they're having constant kind of issues. So you've got lots of stomach stuff, rib stuff, breathing stuff, you feel anxious all the time, sick to your stomach. I've created what's called, I call the heat protocol. So heat is one of the signaling systems to the body that it's safe. Not a cold plunge. We could talk about a cold plunge on a day that I pick cold plunging violence. Today I do not pick cold plunging violence. Today I'm picking heat love. So heat
Think saunas, not cold plunges.
signals, yes. And so specific heat or localized heat. So you get a heating pad or a wheat bag and you warm it up and you put it right underneath your ribs, right where your tummy is, or a little bit lower than that. And you just lay there and you breathe into the heat. Even if you have no symptomatology,
Hmm.
that alone creates an awareness of that part of the body that over time you should start to feel yourself more. Why does that matter? Because when something starts to feel uncomfortable for you, whether you're working out or you're at a desk or your children are creating distress for you or you get anxious or you do panic attacks, our job is to try to get some information prior to it becoming out of our control, prior to us physically hurting ourselves, prior to us going into a panic or anxiety attack. Prior to that, we can actually go, oh, I know what this is. And I can actually just let it move through me. It's a 60 to 90-second emotional cascade of chemicals. And you can actually go, this is just going to move through me. And you can come back to regulation in 60 to 90 seconds. And when you get really good at this, you can come back in like seconds and come right back to it. But you can't do that if you have no sense of your body.
Yeah.
Those of you that are really active, if you work out quite a bit, yoga is great because what yoga does is it really
Yeah.
does show people where their body is in space and they have to actually
Hmm.
breathe into certain areas.
Yeah.
I'm not a yoga kind of girl. I go to the gym. You can
Yeah.
do the same thing when you're working out with men and women. I have them focus on certain target areas. I have them focus on flexing certain areas. And a lot of people just can't feel certain parts of their body at all. And that just is that neck down dead because over time that really your brain does that to protect you,
Yeah.
but we don't want to be protected for all of our lives. We have to be able to be integrating this information through our lives, particularly as we get older, because a lot of our seniors today that we're observing that are really, oh, that's terrible. We always say they're just dying for a long time. and they're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
living vitally.
Yeah.
A lot of these seniors, if we'd have seen them 25, 30 years ago, probably would have had a different conversation with them at that time. They just don't know where their body's in space. They can't feel anything. Lots of them are on lots of different drugs for lots of symptoms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really keeping them numb away from what's going on for them. And which is not how we want to age. In my generation, I don't want to age that
No.
way. I want to age as clear and present and feeling as possible so I can make decisions in the moment that will serve me versus leaving it so long. And then it's a big epic cleanup.
It's interesting. Yeah, because I'm pushing 50 now, and you do kind of think, how do I want to wake up on my 80th birthday?
Or
You know,
patients will say, I don't want to live to be 80 or 100. And I
I
say, you don't
know.
get
And I'm
that
like,
choice.
why? Yeah, exactly. You
You
might
don't
hit
get that
89.
choice.
I
You
mean,
might
do you
hit
want to?
102.
Yeah.
I said, more the question would be, what if I did live to be
Yes.
102?
Yeah.
Because if I did live to be 102, would I still be behaving the way I am now? And
Yeah.
probably not. So that's what my focus is. Because I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't even know if I have tomorrow. But as
Yeah.
long as I have right now, I am going to revere the vehicle that I'm in as much as I can and
Yeah.
still have fun.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah. Yeah.
into restriction, but I want to do that as much as I can because what if I do hit 102,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Well, it's interesting what you say because obviously I follow you on Instagram and you are in phenomenal shape. I mean, if anyone wants to
Ooh,
follow Brandy, please
thank you.
follow
Oh,
her. You're incredibly inspiring.
thank you.
But I think for women too, like I'm a very go-go, like I love my to-do lists. And, when I'm stressed, I go for a very long run or a cycle. And like I'm kind of an aerobic junkie, really. I mean, I do yoga, but probably not as often as I used to. But yeah, so you're constantly burning and burning and burning. And I realize now as I get older, you probably not slow down, I guess, but I don't know. What do we do? Because you say everyone's doing, 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 but you also want to, I mean, pushing 50 is not old.
Totally.
So, I mean, we don't want to
Absolutely.
slow down too much, but then we
What's
also have to take
funny,
care of this nervous system if it's overwhelmed.
I think the nice thing about this hierarchy, so if you imagine, I'm more of a sympathetically orientated person. It sounds
Yeah.
like you are as well.
Yeah.
We use activity to actually dial down. So I find that working out actually creates more regulation for me. I can actually bring myself down through working out. So when you're sympathetically oriented, very often activity is what actually brings you back to a more regulated state.
Yeah. Because I always feel better after.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Now, the opposite with the majority of women I work with, they're actually more in a dorsal vagal complex or a circuitry or a dominance, as we call it, which means they're like, oh my God, I can't even get up and go for a walk. And so they actually need activity, but that's different than, say, the activity you and I might do, but for the same reason. So activity regulates always, movement always regulates.
Hmm.
So if somebody needs to regulate, it's always going to be movement, but it might be different. So if somebody's really sluggy and slow, the tough thing is they have to do the opposite. Because remember, as much as we devolve from ventral regulated connected state all the way down to frog licking our eye, we actually come back up the hierarchy the same way. So somebody who is in that dorsal slower, lowered circuit break kind of state actually has to come into more of a sympathetic state before they go into a more regulated state. So what that means for them and for folks that feel that way is that it is super uncomfortable because it almost feels like it's too much, too overwhelming. So sometimes they need to just start with walking or do more yoga classes.
Yeah.
I prefer if they're in the dorsal state that they do group activities because that's how they get their
Okay.
connection.
Yeah.
Where when you're more sympathetic, remember it's metabolically expensive, but it's also short-lived. So you're
Yeah.
more likely to do stuff alone and you still feel more regulated after, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it is kind of nice to know what your default pattern is. By the way, we learn those defaults. We neurologically learn those defaults when we were babies. So it's based on how we were tuned and attended to when our ventral system was developing. So you don't actually remember how you learned your default system. You just behaved accordingly and ended up with that default. It doesn't mean you have to stay that way. It
Yeah.
just, when you understand that, you sort of know how to support the nervous system to more of a state of regulation, particularly when you start to feel that dysregulated kind of, oh, I call it the tap out, the MMA tap out is the dorsal, like I'm tapping out. And there's a
Yeah.
feeling to tapping out, or for us, it's a reactive, like, oh, I've got to do more. That's unhealthy. That means we're going into that. I better do more, like get more, run more. That's where you run the risk of getting hurt or burning out. So once you understand that, you do kind of make decisions differently. And I think you
Yeah.
start to look at your energy stores throughout your day. When I was in my 20s or 30s, I never looked at energy stores. Who care? You don't
I've got
realize how
loads.
vitally, yeah, God, you can do this all day long for weeks on end.
I can go out 7 days a week. I'm fine.
I could stay up till 2 in the
Yeah.
morning. I could go to work. Yeah, those days are long gone. But now it's more about I know when my energy stores are, and I just sort of do it in my energy store time. And then when I'm not there, I'm actually not doing anything.
Hmm.
And by the way, doing nothing is actually an activity.
Yeah.
It's a
I
tough
find that
one.
one hard.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but it is actually an activity.
Oh, super interesting. I was going to ask you something. When you, I guess when you start to understand this stuff, what are like is there a connection between, I guess, how do you relate this to chiropractic? Because obviously you've grown up in a chiropractic world, you've got a uh social care background. How did this come about with chiropractic? Like how do you integrate these two? Because a lot of people listening to this have probably never been to a chiropractor. So how do they connect? How do they join up?
Well, if my practice is any indication, the majority of people don't even know that they have a nervous system. So I
Yeah.
would say that a lot of folks that have not seen a chiropractor before think that we, fix some back pain, maybe some headaches. Sort of that's our job and that's sort of what we do. And although those things go away under care, that's not really for those of us in this brand of chiropractic, which we call nervous system focused chiropractic, that is actually not what we do. And so the two really meld together beautifully because in chiropractic, the job of a chiropractor has always been to connect the brain to the body and the body to the
Hmm.
brain. That is the basic premise of chiropractic. And the highway in which, or the vehicle in which they use is the spine. And so because of that, the general public, I can see why they would think, oh, well, I lay on my stomach, somebody touches my back, I get better. I don't know how that works, but it works.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. And
yeah,
so all over the world for 150 years, this has been going on. And with stories that, unless you've been, you wouldn't really even know the depth and breadth of chiropractic. Polyvagal really blends beautifully into this in the sense that we want to be able to feel our body. And what happens under chiropractic care for a lot of patients is they start to feel things they've never felt before,
yeah,
both on what they would believe a good end and both on a bad end. And so for people, we just want them to understand that as that brain starts to become more aware of itself. So a nervous system that's aware of itself makes totally different neurological decisions than one that is distorted. And so chiropractic has always been about helping clean up the information
yeah,
highway so it's less distorted.
yeah,
Polyvagal is really using other tools to help clear up the information highway, but it's really focusing a lot on the vagus nerve versus
yeah,
spinal nerves. When
yeah,
you marry those two together, you have this beautiful harmony of a chiropractor and a patient working together in what we would call a co-regulatory aspect of connection, because touch is the number one quickest main line into the nervous system. Number two, using movement and often rhythm through the chiropractic adjustment to create regulation within the system. And three, the patient's stress factor into the chiropractor, which opens up this highway into the nervous system that says, you know what, I'm with another human,
yeah,
another mammal
yeah,
that's safe, and my body goes into a totally different state. And those of you listening that have been to a chiropractor, that is why very often people come in to get checked that have no pain, no symptoms, just in regular care, go, I didn't even know I needed that.
yeah, yeah,
Because we just every millisecond of every day that we're alive, we are under tension. And time under tension is not a good thing in the nervous system if we don't keep
no,
cleaning it, micro cleaning it. And so those two things really do work together in beautiful harmony, both from the co-regulatory aspect of mammal to mammal and connection, through the
yeah,
movement aspect of the chiropractic adjustment and rhythm and allowing the spine to move freely and clearly so that the brain gets better information. And also through the touch aspect of the main line into the nervous system that says, you know what, you're safe,
yeah,
not physically safe, but neurologically safe. You can regulate differently. And the nervous system doesn't need any help after that. It sorts it
yeah,
out
yeah,
once
yeah, yeah,
that's all
yeah,
sorted.
yeah. It's interesting. I did a breathwork workshop last night at the practice, and I didn't realize breathwork was that popular, but we had like so much interest in it. And we had a few patients come, and then a lot of it was just external people coming into the practice to learn. And I had a few women come up after, and she said, I had absolutely no idea what chiropractic did. Like, I just thought you guys moved a bunch of bones around and just, that you went for back pain. It's really and so they were kind of floored. They're like, learned a lot about breath work, but I didn't realize what chiropractic did. It's so in the dark still. It's unreal.
It's very, it's funny when you're in this sort of polyvagal sort of social work,
Yeah,
psychology world of regulation, all the time we're like, oh, they're talking chiropractic and
I know.
they
And they don't
you
even
don't
know it.
realize it. The difference is they're using modalities that take way longer.
Yeah,
Because chiropractic, I just call it the main line into the nervous system. It's the
yeah,
fastest. It's
yeah,
a nervous system gets regulated immediately upon an adjustment, whether
yeah,
somebody feels better or not. And
yeah,
so it's really fascinating to dig into this and go, oh my God, I'm so frustrated that we're chiropractors. And again, it's not the public's responsibility. It was ours. It was
mm,
our responsibility to educate. And when people come into our practice and they're frustrated and they go, why hasn't anybody even explained this to me before?
yeah.
I'm apologizing on a weekly basis to you people for not doing our job well, because what we do is supported by science, it's supported by neuroscience, it's just not chiropractic science. So
Yeah,
we're having to extrapolate all of these sciences, but then say, like the powders, oh my God, this totally makes sense. I
yeah,
why And that people also understand, by virtue of coming into a practice like yours, that the whole Arnold Schwarzenegger TikTok video phenomenon.
yeah,
I always say to new patients, we're not Arnold Schwarzenegger breaking your neck here. Like, there are so many ways to impact the nervous system through different types of adjustments.
yeah.
And just a quick note on, I could talk for hours, so I better just wrap this up. But quick note on breath work. One of the things that's really interesting about polyvagal and the work we do now is that we do a lot of rib work, because this rib cage that works like this ecosystem, I call it, and it's not just like individual rib heads, it works together. And in order for us to breathe appropriately, the rib cage has to move properly.
Yeah,
And for a lot of our people, their rib cage is so stuck in protection.
yeah,
That tells us how long somebody has been in this de-evolved threat response of the nervous system, because we can tell by their posture. And when the posture is in the state of protection and the ribs are caved onto the lungs and somebody can't extend properly, they have a really hard time doing breath work, because it actually bugs them. It actually
yeah.
bothers them. And so there's another sort of beautiful harmony with this polyvagal breath and chiropractic, because a lot of our women that do yoga or breath work outside
Hmm.
the office, once their ribs move better, they're gobsmacked at the difference in what they're doing outside the office, because now they actually can actually expand their lungs properly, and the diaphragm moves properly, and everything, it bellows the way it's supposed to, versus short shallow breaths. And so that's another great relationship, I think, there with breath work and chiropractic and polyvagal.
Yeah. I think you can't solve all the problems. You can't stay healthy with one bucket. I always say
No.
you've got to do all of them. So just, and obviously we know what those are. But that
However, you were
was
gonna pick if you were gonna pick one, I'd pick chiropractic first,
oh, I
and
know,
then
I know.
then I would pick the rest.
I know I had to apologize last night. I'm going to talk about breath work, but I'm also going to talk a lot about chiropractic because
Totally.
that is number one. What would be, I actually just wanted, I know, I just want to talk briefly because we talked about connection. What happened to your patients? What did you see after the pandemic?
Well, similar to the UK, we were closed for a good period of time. And when people came back to us, what we really noticed was there was an intense level of fear in their bodies.
Yeah.
So I would say fear would be the first thing we noticed that was palpable. And that fear was around everything, not
Yep.
just what they thought they should be afraid of, like other humans or going on public or flying. Like, people were just afraid in general. And so that's really when we started digging into polyvagal. And one of the things in my old world that we were really careful about in social work was we always had to make sure that we were predictable for people, because the number one violation of the nervous system is when you violate somebody's predictability. So the nervous system craves predictability. It doesn't crave rigidity. It just craves to know what is next. And in the pandemic, for 2 years after at least, there was such an immense amount of unpredictability in the world and
Yeah.
in people's lives. That was such a violation to their nervous system. That is what we observed that was beneath the fear. The not knowing what was going to come tomorrow, the not knowing if people were going to have a job, the not knowing if their parents were okay, then that actually was the issue. And that's what was behind the fear, because that violation of the nervous system is probably, short of a physical trauma, one of the most injurious things to our health is living in unpredictability. You will
Yeah.
see this in people who escape from war-torn countries. That is what happens when they escape, because they've lived in such chaos.
Yeah.
They are unwell if they ever come out of that. And at the far end of that, you will have obviously some mental health challenges like PTSD and things
Yeah.
like that, because you don't know. And so we don't seek to know everything, but the nervous system does seek to know what's next. And with the pandemic, because it was so many years after, it wasn't just a one and done, as you all know,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
happened for a long time after that people just didn't know. So
Yeah.
we dealt with that protection for a long time. And I would contend we still today really deal with a lot of protected nervous systems.
Yeah.
It's just the world started turning again. We could go on vacation, we could
Yeah.
see our families again. But that doesn't mean the nervous system forgets. Just because our conscious brain said, no, no, we're done.
Yeah.
Today, we still see a lot of those protected bodies, and they show up like weird, out of the blue, this happened. And I don't know why this keeps happening. And then all of a sudden, and of course, with our teenagers and our young children who were violated against as far as their predictability, and with their friends and their connections, where while they're still developing their nervous system, we're
Yeah.
really seeing the impact of that with our anxiety and social anxiety and school stuff. That's all a result of that period of time with that generation, for sure.
Yeah. Because it's quite crazy. They're now saying in the UK that 25% of Brits are classified as disabled because they've lumped mental
Wow.
health in there. So, and the
Yes.
numbers are staggering after the pandemic. And children, I mean,
Wow.
I don't know, I'm not going to say the number, but there are so many children that can't. And I know some of my patients, their children still aren't back at schools. They just because their anxiety levels are just they're so high they can't actually function in society anymore. And it
Yes.
was since the pandemic. So that
Yes.
isolation.
Yes, there's lots of studies actually. I did a presentation just a few months ago on the loneliness epidemic. And
Yeah.
actually today there's actually a ton of studies done on how many people tell, when they're doing the studies, that they're actually
Yeah.
lonely. But, so what we see today is we see people surrounded by people, but they're lonely. So that
Yeah.
means there's no actual connection there anymore. And
Yeah.
when you have taken mammals, and you take these mammals and you tell one mammal that the other mammal is going to kill them, that is taking sort of our basest fear and using it against one another, which is what humans did at that time.
Yeah.
And we are now living in the sort of the dregs of that now, even 5 years later.
Yeah.
We're really, I mean, this weekend's the anniversary for us of our practice closing and people not being able to access us. And so that happened today, actually 5 years ago today. And so it is really, I would contend that those people that came out of the pandemic less scarred than others
Yeah.
probably kept connection with people enough that they didn't feel as isolated. That didn't mean
Yeah.
everybody, was good. And
Yeah.
those who didn't, they're really struggling. And our kids, the reason the kids are is because they haven't developed, they're not fully
Yeah.
developed yet. And when
Yeah.
you take the ability for a mammal to be away from their herd, and their herd keeps them alive,
Yeah.
that mammal dies. The difference is we have houses over us, food, water, cars,
Yeah.
activities, but our kids and many of our adults are dying inside because they don't have that connection. And that ventral part of the vagus is critical for physical and mental well-being.
Oh, it's incredible, actually. The studies will continue to come out, I'm sure, as
Yeah,
they start pouring out right now.
yeah.
Well, that was fascinating. And I'm actually going
Yeah.
to see you soon.
Amazing.
And I can't wait.
Yay.
It's going to be great.
Yay.
What is the one thing that you'd like people to come get away from today?
You know what? I think that there's always hope. I think one of the things that we don't take into account enough is how resilient our bodies are and
Mm,
how resilient the nervous system is. So number one, there's always help. There's always help. There are lots of us in this world working, helping people in any country, in any city. There's always help for you. So if you're struggling and you don't know where to go, or you've tried to get help elsewhere and it have felt like it hasn't been the right help for
Yeah.
you, keep looking. So that would be the one thing I would say, because we are super resilient as humans, but we do need the right human to help
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And so just because they're human doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be helpful. And we just see the world differently. I mean, in chiropractic, I always say to our patients, we're not medicine. Medicine is there for pathology. When
Yeah.
scary things happen and you need intervention, you need medicine. We need it. We're
Yeah.
there for everything else. We're there for dysfunction. We're there for distortion. We're there for general well-being. Like, we just see the world differently, and we see
Yeah.
people differently. And because of that, very often we're the answer for a lot of people who have been elsewhere. So that's what I would leave you with.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to diving in, learning more.
Yes, I love it. As you can tell, I could talk for days, but I will be now officially done talking.
No, I think our workshop went like way over.
Okay.
I could
Whoops,
just talk
sorry.
last night. So I want to thank you so much. We will put all Brandy's details in the show notes, and I'll put the books that we discussed in the show notes as well. But if you want to get in touch with Brandy, her contact details will be there. Please do so. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please subscribe, and we'll see you on the next show.